Hello, everyone, and welcome to this question and answer session with Becky Aud-Jennison, the author of Death and Its Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Beautiful Lessons. And I'm so grateful that Becky is here and giving us her time. She's actually kind of on a family personal trip through the US right now, but it happened to work out. This is the month when A Year of Reading Dangerously is reading her book, and it worked out that we were able to match up our schedules well enough that we could do this 1 hour Q&A session together. And so I'm really glad that so many people signed up, and some who aren't going to be with us live, but they'll get the recording later. And I just want to thank you all for reading the book if you have, and for joining us here. So Becky, as some of you probably know, is the host of the Death Dialogues Project podcast. And that's where the book came from, and Becky can tell us more about that. So Becky, hi and welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today.
Yeah, I'm just excited for everyone to have a chance to talk to you and just to hear more from you, Becky, about your beautiful book. And I kind of, as we begin this, I mean, you and I were talking before we started recording about that it's a little bit of a shock, I imagine, a culture shock for someone who's been living in New Zealand for a number of years. You happen to come back to the US this month when so much has happened here. We crossed the 1 million threshold, 1 million deaths threshold from COVID. We've had these mass shootings that have completely devastated so many of us and shattered us just hearing this news. And I'm sure for you there's a bit of shock as well.
Absolutely. There absolutely is. Yeah, so COVID wise, interestingly, not so much difference because once Omicron made its way into New Zealand, they gave up on trying to eliminate COVID. And so we had been having more loose restrictions. However, I live on top of a hill in New Zealand and rarely get out. So for me, just to be out and about in towns and airports and negotiating all of that has been different. And it's been an eye-opening experience. And so far, I have dodged a lot of COVID with people close to me, near and far. And I test before I go everywhere, and let's knock on wood that continues. Oh, sorry, the dog thinks I'm knocking on the door. Let's just knock on wood that continues, because this is a 12-week trip. And I was telling Karen, my husband is a person that's not a very anxiety prone person at all. And he called me one day after the first shootings, after I got here, and said, promise me that you won't go to a mall. Promise me you will not step foot in a shopping mall. And I'm not a shopper anyway, so that wasn't a big promise. I said, no, I'm not really going much of anywhere. Went out to eat a couple times. And then, of course, I really don't think it's healthy for me to start talking about the school shootings, because it's such a big subject and it's so devastating. And it feels so hopeless that I'm sure we're all having parallel conversations with other people at other times. So yeah, I might not want to open that, except to say it's been very emotional for me as I'm here with my loved ones and getting to know 2 grandchildren. I have 1 more to meet. I've got an 8-year-old that's going to school every day, and I'm listening to how their family's processing it, and everyone's processing it in my life. And it's just a time that when I was a little girl going to school in America, I could have never imagined. This feels like such a dystopian science fiction
Yeah.
story that I feel like we're just being dropped into.
Well, I wanted to use that in a way because your book deals with grief so beautifully from so many different perspectives, to really just talk about grief and how we come together and grieve, and some things that we might take away from your book that we can all use for ourselves about our own grief process right now as we're grieving. And one chapter that stood out for me was saying grief as your new life partner. And I think that's something that maybe we're all seeing right now, is that we may just need to welcome grief into our lives and not expect that we're going to take it away or eliminate it from our lives. But I don't know if you'd like to talk about that.
No, I think, as most of you know, if you've read the book, this book doesn't just focus on grief, but we do look at the many facets that have come up for me personally and for the people I've worked with over 30 years, and things that we haven't heard of so much. And I think that one thing, to me, it's about living more expansively and from a full spectrum, and looking at life and being able to experience the beautiful and the beautiful horrible. We are looking at the horrible and opening our eyes to that. And when we start doing that, we're actually, in times like these, our tender hearts are being bruised on a daily basis practically. And I think, Karen, what I'd like to maybe even start out with, if the group doesn't mind, is sharing the bit that's called Help Me Now, because it comes from my clinical practice. And I actually did a podcast on this when COVID started, because it can be used to alleviate so many ways of suffering that we have individually and as a whole. And it's science-based, and it's about balancing our autonomic nervous system, but looking at it through the eyes of grief. Would you like me to?
Oh, yes, please do. Please do.
Because
I'd
of
love
the
that.
state we're in, I just think it might be a good centering for all of us. So I wanted, because I know sometimes when we're going to the bookshelves to look for a book on death or grief, we're in a state of acute crisis for ourselves. Not always. Sometimes it's a place of curiosity. But I wanted this in there for those people who just needed somewhere to say, just give me a bit of a break right now. Please help me right now. So this little section is in the Meet Your New Life Partner Grief, and it's called Help Me Now. For those of you who might be frantically searching the pages of this book for the answers to grief, the cure, I'm sorry to report that there is none. Many people attempt to escape their anguish, succumbing to the culture's hypnotic plea of get over it, practicing the same compartmentalization they've probably applied to difficult emotions throughout their lives, filing away the hard. People like me, and probably you, just can't do that. Deep feelers must let grief have its way with us. As for the stuffers, the get on with it folks, grief will have its way with them as well, but it may come out lopsided. There are folks who will experience a less intense reaction because of a belief system they've developed or engaged in. Then it may look more of an adjustment period than the sore emotions we think of as accompanying grief. Get on with it folks might hide their reactions in compulsive behaviors, too muchness, too much work, or alcohol, or substances, or rage, or isolation that morphs into depression, or whatever it is for the individual that can bang a drum louder than the echoes of the loss. But it's a common belief that we, the wallowers, the ones to whom people will long to implore, can't you move on already, are actually the ones who are letting grief have its way with us. Just today, I heard from a parent who had found their young adult child who died of an overdose a couple of months earlier. They were feeling tortured, wondering if they would ever feel alive again, haunted by the image of finding their child, aching for what will never be, tearing themselves apart for not finding a way to save that child. This process will totally dismantle them. You can understand why someone in that position might feel like giving up at times. It can feel so hard and unsurmountable. And I will just say, thinking of all those parents right now, we can sit with that for them. Please try to remember that the taking a part of you that is happening in the throes of deep loss is a normal part of the process. It will be slow and it will be painful. And eventually there will be a time when you actually have a choice of how you want to be put back together. When you can just start imagining what that transformation might look like. That's your little bell tinkling, like in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life, that signaled an angel getting their wings. For you, that little bell signals my love's death and the love we have together is growing something new inside me. Maybe you start noticing that the beautiful memories are taking up more space in your brain than the tragic ones. Maybe it's as simple as how you walk in the world. Maybe you find yourself becoming filled with more compassion for others who have similar experiences. Or maybe it's who you will now reach out to give your time. It may be what art you will decide to finally make or do in a different way. And as you will see in these pages, it sometimes heralds massive personal transformation. That's been witnessed by many of the folks interviewed for this project. That process takes time. Early on in the incubation period, where you need to cocoon yourself gently, taking great care of your basic needs, death and what grief asks of you can be utterly exhausting. Your body needs rest, nourishment, hydration, gentle holding. Your mind needs a break. Work on releasing the what ifs, the regret, beating yourself up, obsessive thinking about the process of the person's dying. Your heart needs love. One small practice that has provided great relief in those early days is simple. Take a moment alone, put some relaxing music on if you can, that's not mandatory, and feel yourself grounded into your body. And I would suggest we do this together now. And then begin taking nice, even breaths in and out. And try to establish a rhythm of 5 to 6 counts in and 5 to 6 counts out. And the number of the seconds isn't as important as keeping the breath even. Make it a comfortable, doable rhythm. And with each exhalation, mindfully imagine your love leaving your heart and landing in the heart of your deceased loved one. And on the inhale, imagine their love coming into your heart. And try to stay with this practice for 5 to 10 minutes. And I'll stop there. There's a little bit more in that section that talks a bit about the science behind that as well. But for myself, what I do, and actually this is based on an organization called HeartMath's work, and they have actually monitored changes in the magnetic resonance around the world when people are doing this in massive quantities in different geographic areas. And frequently they had a global coherence initiative program where they would contact us for something like the shooting and ask us all to be doing this method and sending loving energy with that exhale to these parents and to the community or whatever that situation was. So that is something I feel is in my power to do. It's sometimes the only power I feel like I have to help other people, and in turn, breathing the love back to myself and just returning to love during those times.
I think that's really beautiful. And you're right. One of the overwhelming feelings when we've gone through something like this is of being powerless or helpless, but to have a simple practice. And you're right. They've shown, the HeartMath Institute has shown that it does make a difference when we actually practice on behalf of other people and send love to other people. It truly is something that we can do that benefits us and benefits them.
Yeah, it's science now.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's nice to have that because it isn't just a theory that we would like to believe in, but it's really been studied and tested. And
I've
that's
been in this
phenomenal.
work long enough I used to say, I was just the out there woman who used to work with people about there's the breath lady. And then when I had the technology to actually measure their heart rate variability and watch them see the real-time changes, that really helped cement the practices, because no longer did that just seem, woo-woo. It was real, because what they were feeling, they knew was real. They were,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I want to advise listeners that Becky and I can easily talk nonstop for
Yeah,
this
yeah.
entire hour. But if you would like to help direct the conversation and ask a question, please type in your question in the chat or raise your hand so you can get involved, because she and I will just take off and you may not have a chance to ask what you want, because I'm going to ask what I want. So while we wait to see if anybody wants to step up with a question, one thing that, as well, while we're talking along these lines, I was really interested in, Becky. You talked about how babies are born with different types of nervous systems, so each one of us, some of us are more hypersensitive and some of us are just more mellow and less sensitive. No judgment whatsoever, but there's a whole spectrum there, and that may influence how we deal with things that happen. And I was really fascinated by that. If there's anything you want to share more about that.
Well, it's so interesting to bring that up right now while I'm meeting two grandchildren, and with my 8-year-old granddaughter who came, so yeah, so what we've looked at historically, if you, and some of you may remember, depending on what your backgrounds are, or just even in basic psych courses or parenting courses, we talk about babies' temperaments. And they'd usually just separate into 3 different levels. And it would be like the active baby, and then the medium baby, and then the lower activity baby. And so my 8-year-old granddaughter was in that lower activity range. Like, you could, in fact, I have a video of my daughter clapping in front of her, and she would blink and smile. She just was not a startler. She would go to bed very, very easily, just very self-soothing. And then you have, and I would call her in the lower range. And then you have the average, that does a little bit of that and a little bit of, can get cranky. And then you have the more active temperament. And those would be the babies that, increase startle reflex, and maybe a bit more difficulty sleeping, have to work on sleep a little bit more. And just, I had, my first was one of those babies, and I used to describe it as, it was always the season of her discontent. Like, as a newborn, you felt like she was trying to sit up, right? And then, when she's sitting up, you can tell she just wants to get that, just very alert, active. And while the one that wasn't, my granddaughter, she's very alert as well, and very, meeting her developmental tasks, but just very peaceful and calm. And I'm watching as she's more aware with COVID, what's happened. And with the environment, of course, they try to shield, but they're a very politically active family. And so they go to Black Lives Matters protests and everything. And I can see how her little internal idol is amping up a bit. There's a bit more reason to have this anxiety. So it gets back to the nurture and nature as well, right? Because any of us, we could have a low-key temperament, and which would mean our autonomic nervous system wasn't really set and high up in the sympathetic drive, fight, flight, or really accessing that just for normal stresses, not just the big ones. And that's what's behind anxiety kind of symptoms and excessive worry, panic, that kind of thing. So you can be in environments with undue stress. So you can have the person that's as calm as they could have been, but those parents of the children in that shooting, and those classmates of the children in those shootings, and that entire school, their nervous systems are now on high alert. And it is going to take work to get that down. And that may be work that does or doesn't happen, depending on awareness and how the school approaches it, how parents if they get their children the help they need. And let's be frank, what therapists you see. I always recommend that this is the kind of symptom control work you do with a person before you start digging too deep in the issues, because what does the digging into the trauma do? It's just heightening that fight flight again. And sometimes what you find is once we start getting that autonomic nervous system balanced, the issues are sometimes not having such a big spotlight on them anymore. That part of that could have been the repetitive thinking that was going along with the fight flight that got the anxiety going. Primary symptom of anxiety is obsessive kind of thinking. Can't, like when you can't fall asleep because you continue to have something on your mind. That's a little bit of that fight flight going. So yeah, it's a interesting concept about nature and nurture. And I would just argue, Karen, I'm sorry to say it, but we're in a world where, you got to work. You got to work to keep that autonomic balance. It doesn't matter what temperament you were born with. We all need to work on that on a day in, day out basis. If you're in the know at all, if you're not living on it, even a more remote island than New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Kathy Duke typed in a question. She asked, you recommend that people face their own death and prepare, will, advance directive, etc. As a counselor myself, I urge clients to prepare, but many are terrified of talking about their death. Any recommendations that you have?
Well, I would just always open up the question of why and what were their first experiences surrounding death, and see if that opens up a pathway of, was there actually an experience they had? Because sometimes there are, and then that can be unpacked further. But also sometimes it's just societally, as I talk about in the book, it's just shelved. And so, to me, those are the two very broad forks in the road to go down. And it's where you want to meet the person where they're at, and have a gentle, supportive inquiry of how they would like to move forward with that. But it may be that they need to do a bit of unpacking of some trauma first, if they were exposed to something that has them very averse to death, as we know can happen.
Yeah, it makes sense as you're saying. Some of it could just be because they've never talked about it before.
Yeah.
They don't even know how to talk about it or what words to use or how do you bring this up and discuss it, which is a sad reflection on how much our society has shelved death as you're describing, but it's really good to broach the subject and at least bring it up and see how they respond to it.
How they talk about when when your child comes. I might have even written this in the book, something about this. I think I did, about when your child approaches you and asks you about where babies come from. And, our recommendations were always, well, where do you think they come from? And go with their level of knowledge at that point in time. Really a good place to start with death.
Yeah.
I'm really apprehensive about death. Well, why do you think that is? I know as therapists, we're not always encouraged to ask the why question, but that's an area that I think it's fair to. And, what has happened to you? Is there experiences that you've had, or are there just thoughts that you have? Or, sometimes it can be seeing movies, and it's just denial. I really think there's magical thinking in society, and has been for, through history, that if we don't think about it, then it maybe we can delay it, even to the point sometimes magically of thinking you can avoid it. Like, I don't know, whoever thinks that you can get out of here, get a, skip death for free card, but I've talked to people that they almost have that level of magical thinking.
Mm-hmm. And that if they do talk about it, they're going to bring it on more quickly.
Exactly.
They'll make
That's
it happen. Yeah.
right. Right. Absolutely.
Marsha Robbins just mentioned, I did a year-long program through hospice and followed a year to live, and that was a really good experience. So it does sound like if we can help people kind of step by step, gradually come to terms with the idea of death, that can be really helpful too.
Absolutely. Oh, so, life and death follows you everywhere. And on this trip, I have someone right now that I'm very close to who is had cancer previously and has had some signs show up on tests that she's basically convinced herself that it's very likely that there's metastatic disease. And what has happened in this past week is a massive amount of expansion. She had something go off that was, we were able to have the conversation always is we might die tomorrow. I mean, we might die tomorrow. We don't know whether we have a disease or not. But having this little possibility hanging over her head has had her just in a very, very short few days practicing this expansion and doing some things and planning some things that she'd been putting on hold. And I think that's the lovely thing of activities like the Year to Live. We should all be living like that every day. We don't know. I know you love Kate Manser as well, and he's morphed into another platform, but I wear my t-shirt loud and proud. You might die tomorrow, so live today.
Yeah, so true, because that is the one way to get to the end of your life and not have many regrets, is if every day you live as fully as you can. And I think that comes through loud and clear in your message and the conversations that you've had with people too.
I think for me, that's the beautiful horrible, right? I mean, there's so many beautiful horrible things that I could point out, but that's expansively the beautiful horrible. Because I'm not here to tell you death is going to be easy when it comes to your closest people leaving the planet if you're the survivor. I mean, no, I mean, that's not what my message is about. My message is about walking into it eyes wide open and heart wide open. And that if we can meet it throughout the process and meet our people, if it's not a sudden death, if we're able to walk into those spaces, that's where the beautiful walks alongside the horrible, is when we can decide that this is the way I'm going to live because the inevitability of death. People's hearts are broken. They don't want to take about how many of us would have had children if we would have really sat down and processed the fact that our children could die before us, or that we could watch our children suffer. There's ways I believe that we're genetically programmed, just much like any of you that have given birth that have experienced the amnesia, not long after birth, that there's certain places that we wouldn't go if we thought of everything that might happen. Yeah, so I think it's just about, I feel more expansion, more joy, but I also feel really deep, deep sadness and mourning and some anticipatory mourning. Karen knows my husband had a really severe heart attack in December. The Widowmaker, my retired cardiologist husband, who was in great, perfect shape. And, I know anticipatory anxiety or anticipatory grief. I've been there, I've lived in that before, and now I have another dose of that. So, I have had a lot, like many of you, a lot of deaths in a short period of time, and a lot of situations for that. No, it's not my favorite place to be by any means. It's not what I really wish on people, but it's life. It's where we walk. It's where we live. And I know the flip side of that is if I compartmentalize it, if I just put my head down, it is not authentically living. The beautiful somehow goes to the background because I'm not living my full spectrum of emotions. I'm overdoing, I'm over trying to numb those feelings in whatever way possible is really what all that overdoing is, right? Overeating, over exercising, over working, over drinking, over medicating. It's just help me, and I think most of the people I would talk to that kind of live in this beautiful, horrible place is this baptism by immersion, this going in, wading into the water and being held under. You come up not refreshed and sparkly clean, but you come up knowing you've been under the water. And that's going to make the next time I go under the water a little different for me, because I'm going to take some of that experience. And like, I have relatives, some of the ones I'm talking about, that were present for us keeping my brother home for the 3 days, would have never imagined that that could have been possible, right? And so they are walking into this space in a totally different way. They took the beautiful of the horrible and they filed that away. And that's where we're at. Some people in life, I don't have any judgment. It's like, if you're like, yay, home births, I'm yay home births, yay elective C-sections. I mean, I'm like that with death. If you want to just do traditional hospital straight to the funeral home, that's fine. I have zero judgment. I just think, just like in all those other areas, we need to be aware that we have choice, because there's so many people that get to that space and afterwards they're saying, oh my gosh, I didn't know it could be any different. Or they read my book or they hear me talk and like, why didn't I know that? So that's why I wanted those kind of things included as well. And I think I've told you, Karen, when in one of our chats, that even as much planning as we had done, as much preparation, we have a willow hand-woven coffin that sits in our living room, that the first person who dies is going to be buried in our natural burial grounds. I mean, we've got this covered. I really got an up close personal, like how the shock brain for the first 48 hours, that just total blackout to 1 minute to the next. And so, when we processed after he was out of the hospital, and, we went through the emotional aspects of it, and then practically, and it was very soon after, because it brought up emotions for me. I said, it's not good enough just having the death file of everything I need to do. If you die first with our finances and everything, I need to know, do this first, do this second, do this third. I need it spelled out, because I can tell me personally, and we only know who we are personally, right? I can't say that for you, but now I know for me, like, I need it mapped out. And most people, they get to that space. Some haven't even made wills. I've heard a few stories of that just in the past week. And then the people that do really have things planned and organized, that feels so much like love to their survivors. That feels so caring. And I think if we can encourage people to look at it that way, as a true act of service and an act of love, that's the way it feels. That's what everybody tells me. That's the way it felt in our lives.
That's so beautiful. And, we keep learning, don't we? Life keeps bringing us these learning opportunities. No matter how much we've already learned, there's some new chapter to write and some new lessons in all of it.
Well, that's why I think it's really hard. And I tried to write from that perspective. There is no book that covers it all. We've got to come at these topics in a way that people can apply it to whatever their emotional literacy is, the way they go to death, you can't predict the kind of deaths you're going to be exposed to. You can't predict the kind of illness or death or sudden death you may have yourself. We do not know. And I think there's a lot of areas in life that I think it's unfortunate we look at it as if it's, okay, stamp that. That's what preparing for end of life should look like, or, That's what grieving should look like, or that's what our end of life celebration, when what we really, really need to be doing is taking the individuality of all of us, all of our loved ones into consideration when we speak of these things and when we're making plans.
So
Like
true.
it's like a thumbprint. And one little book or one little pamphlet at the funeral home doesn't cover it.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I see that Sharon Campbell has a question. So, Sharon, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes.
So I had a death in the family recently, 2 months ago. And this was a person who had done great preparation in terms of the paperwork and had a terminal illness that was diagnosed like 3 years prior. So the person was aware of that. But for a bunch, it could be a big, long story. I'll just suffice it to say that things didn't play out maybe as well as they could have. And I think there were several breakdowns. So, I think there were maybe things not communicated very well by the medical team. I think the patient maybe wasn't ready to hear that the end, despite knowing the person knowing she had a terminal illness, when that is actually upon you, you may not react the way you think you will, even though you've known for 3 years this was coming. So I guess my question is, what advice do you have for, we can prepare and we can have these documents in place, but sometimes it just doesn't play out the way you think it will. And how can we help people? So I'm recently trained as an end-of-life doula. So how can we help people navigate that despite the best planning and doing everything we've been told to do, sometimes it just is a little messier than you thought it would be? And just, do you have any thoughts around that and kind of the flexibility that's needed even when we follow all the rules in terms of planning, we're kind of disappointed in what the result is?
So are you speaking specifically about the dying person's plans for their death or the aftermath for the loved ones?
So this was more about, despite there being kind of a POA doc, there were, healthcare POAs and everything in place, but there just seemed to be the patient didn't acknowledge that despite having a terminal illness, that the death was upon her. Mm-hmm. And yet I don't know that she's to blame for that. I don't have enough details to know whether the medical team did a good job of helping to get her there. So I don't know where the breakdown happened, but I guess I'm just wondering, as a family member and as someone who's going to be supporting families through similar situations, I would never have guessed that this would have played out this way, because she was so prepared and seemed so open to what her diagnosis meant. And so it was shocking to have it play out this way. So
no, I think it's exactly what I was just saying. Like, we just don't know when we get to the crucible, when we're looking over the abyss, we don't know how it is that we're going to respond. You're reminding me of the very first person I did dignity therapy with, and she fully knew the criteria for that was the doctor saying there was probably less than 6 months to live, and she was in hospice. But one of the visits that I had with her, and we became quite close, she was livid that a different doctor who was on, like doing rounds on the weekend, a different doctor had come in and actually talked to her about death, which, yay, doctor, it's rare, that just a general doctor, but she was livid. And I was like, it sounds like kind of where you're coming from. Like, wait a minute, here we are doing this end of life preparation, therapeutic intervention document. And I just had to sit with her. I just had to sit with her where she was, hear her, and understand that I didn't have to understand, that it was just her process,
Right.
and that she had a right to it.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, and that there were so many other things about this that told me that she knew the trajectory she was on, including us developing this therapeutic relationship for dignity therapy. But I hear you.
Okay.
And it's part of the surprises that are going to show up in that work.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. And then Bob Hoffman has a question. Bob, you can unmute. And
yes, Becky. First of all, thanks for sharing the reality of your reaction when you found out about your husband's heart attack, because I've had that kind of feeling like I'm prepared, but am I really prepared when it hits the fan? Yeah. But I wanted to stick a word in here for lightness and humor as a possible intervention, especially for those who are more skeptical about the whole end of life spectrum. For example, last year, in celebration of my 75th birthday, I had my birthday party, invited my children and grandchildren to my newly bought cemetery plot, where we had bagels and lox and wine and cheese. And we had a party at my cemetery plot. And I also subtly snuck in some end of life wishes and descriptions of what I wanted to have happen. But it was done in a rather festive atmosphere. Same thing happened with my mother, who was an anti-death talker. But even after she had a prognosis of pancreatic cancer, didn't want to talk about it until one day we're going to visit my father and brother in the cemetery. And I showed my wife my list of where I wanted my cremation ashes to go. And there were about 12 or 13 different places. And my wife turned to me with my mother in a car and said, "You know, Hoff, I think you're just spreading yourself a little too thin." And for some reason, that turned on my mother's other faucet, and she started to talk about it. And we actually, in the car, designed her headstone, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there are ways to sort of subtly infiltrate without being overly heavy-handed with casket in hand.
I love that, Bob. I really, really do. I wish I would have talked to you before I'd finished writing this book and have that exam. That's just lovely. And it's, it reminds me of the woman who took the dignity therapy document, and she didn't die immediately. And she stood on the table at her birthday party and read it out to people. And, that's full spectrum living, isn't it? That is the beautiful and the funny horrible in that way. I mean, and you know what you're doing. What are those people going to think when they're at that cemetery now, right? They're going to have a little smile somewhere. They may not be able to wear it big on their face, but there's some conditioning that you've already put out there for them. I think it's amazing. I love it. I love that.
And I'm hoping when they come back to visit in future years, I'm hoping they'll still have that same smile of the memory.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's lovely that you thought of that. Thank you for sharing that.
It's like a Dia de los Muertos in advance, before the death, but almost priming everybody like what a great ritual this could be later on.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bob.
And Jennifer Davis also said, "I think that's awesome. Thanks for the ideas, Bob." I like that thought that, I want to be spread too thin after I die. That's fitting. That's how I live my life. Like, why not?
One of the very moving things that's happened to me when I'm in Springfield, Illinois right now, and this is where a lot of family live and where I lived for 25, 30 years. And one of my good friends just so happened to sit with her on one afternoon, and as she was on her deathbed, had just been sent home to hospice. We can have that conversation. It seems a lot of people, hospice comes way, way, way at the end when it could have come earlier and probably done a lot of things. But sat with her and assumed we were getting that close and didn't know. And she said, and I have to share this because this is a little bit of her going out into the world. She always had such a great sense of humor. And, you know, so many people that have walked into in the death arena and worked in hospice have commented on people die the way they lived. Usually you'll see fragments of that. And she could barely talk. And she was just barely getting the words out and had the gurgly breathing. And she said, why did the boy take the toilet papers to the party? And I couldn't even hear, and I had to get closer, and she repeated it. And I said, I don't know why. And she said, because he was a party pooper. This is her in the throes of seeing where she was, you know, she knew where she was at. We talked about the death. And I thought, there you are, dying the way you lived. Can I just take a little of that with me? Isn't that beautiful?
That's great. I love that. Then I'll read a comment by Lynn Mitroen. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that, sorry, Lynn, properly, but I had a sister who died 4 years ago who processed her death the same way as Sharon's family member did. She would not talk about her death, would only talk about the future, would not plan anything. I realized that this was her way and it was okay. When she died, it was very peaceful. My sister came to terms with death in her own way without talking about it. On the other hand, when my brother was dying, he needed to talk and talk and talk about his death. He made all his own plans, visited the funeral home and cemetery personally. To each their own way is the lesson I took out of my siblings' deaths. That's very nice.
Good, yes.
Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah, a good reminder for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. We're all so individual.
I was wondering, Becky, if there's anything, another portion of the book that you would want to read with us, because I don't see any other questions right now, but something else you'd want to share?
Okay, so we're wrapping up on time. So maybe I'll go towards the end and talk about where we talk about transformation. Death Becomes You is the name of
Becky, Becky, could I ask a quick question
Absolutely.
before you do that? Is that okay, Karen?
Sure.
Could you talk a bit about blended families and if any advice about how to, when the children from two different marriages and grandchildren, in terms of preparing for death and the wishes of the mother and father at this point?
Well, I think, you know, the reality of the situation surrounding death, be it a prolonged death or preparing for the funeral, is, many of you have probably experienced, it can be a place for conflict to come out. There's a lot of stress going on. I think what comes to my mind, first of all, is the person's wishes themselves. And the approach I take is, if you want me to be really concrete with a recommendation, what I would consider doing is having like a group chat or a place where everybody can come together that's maybe not confrontational, where you can communicate in that way. And I would suggest whoever can safely do that the easiest is just really laying out some ground rules about, let's try to make this the most peaceful, cooperative thing that we can. You may not be insinuating that there's any conflict there, but sometimes just the question being brought up, it may be that everybody's not in full communication. But I think the most important thing is remembering what the reason is that we're here and who is the person that should be getting the attention, and making it as calm and peaceful. I write in the book, I'm a firm believer that even when there has been, say there is a history, like I had this experience with my father, he was a very abusive man, but even with that, and with how many things that I wish I could have said to him, I believed that he deserved sacredness at the time of passing, that he deserved a peaceful surrounding and existing. Now, that's not to say give people a pass that have been, I just think the work needs to be done before the deathbed is what my suggestion would be. But yeah, I think that if you can get a means to communicate and so people are aware and people feel included, that need to be, but you have to decide who are those people. And that really should come from either the framework of the person that is dying, or if they're alert, if they're alert, their actual words or what the history to be. That would be my recommendation. Any thoughts on that, Karen?
No, I think
you've been in hospice enough, it can be a very, when you got different, I had that situation with my brother. We welcomed his stepdaughter called and said, can my mom come up to the hospital and then be at the home later when he was dying and after his death? And for us, I just said, she kind of approached it in a defensive way, if he was married to my mom too. And I said, you don't have to defend that, of course. But I think it was because I knew that that's what my brother would want as well. If it's going to be somebody that would make him feel tense, I would have advocated for him as I did in every other way with things that were going on with personalities and such. And I think if you can have a gatekeeper in place who is somebody that has some mediation ability, that can just kind of be having a watchful eye and helping facilitate is helpful too. Go on, Karen.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a really good idea to have a mediator. I was thinking, I know palliative care teams are sometimes really good at that, being someone who's just objective about the whole thing, but who can stand back and doesn't have an agenda, doesn't have any emotion involved in it, but that can help lead a really productive discussion about what needs to happen next, and centering it, as you said, on the wishes of the patient, so that get everyone to buy in. We may all have our own thoughts about how things should be, but can we all agree we want the patient to be the one who expresses how it should go?
And it's just another case that step families are all different, blended families are all different. It really, really depends on the dynamics that are involved, for sure.
Yeah, complicated, that's for sure.
Absolutely, as is life. Yeah. Did you want me to read them?
Sure. I was checking. I don't see any other questions. I didn't mean to rush. Oh, Kathy said, how can I move to New Zealand?
Oh gosh, I wish it was that easy. But yeah, you can come visit. Come visit. You can go for a 3-month holiday visa. And then my experience with my mother was you can extend it for 3 months. And there you have 6 months. And then when you want to extend it again, you have to have a physical. But it's almost impossible unless you have a work visa. And if you're over 55, it's almost impossible unless you're bringing a lot of money over. They're very, very strict with migration, but you can figure out ways to come for add time, different times during, or say, I'm going to go spend 6 months a year, that kind of thing. You could try that.
How many guest rooms do you have?
Yeah, right. Not a lot of land. Okay. Bring your tents if we run out. Yeah. Anything else?
I think we're good if you want to go ahead and read to us.
Sure. So, any of you Yeah, any of you who, after deep loss, have chosen to feel your feelings and be open to your cognitive and emotional terrain may recall the turns in the road where you could identify viscerally how your loved one's death was redefining your living and the way you walked in the world. As hard as that process can be, it's even harder to walk blindfolded, stumbling and falling when we feel our emotional foundation shaking and trembling beneath us. When we feel crevices forming that make our walking more treacherous and disjointed, when what previously held us up is forever changed. Trying to hide from death and grief, we may find that we can't put our finger on the why of it all because we have blocked ourselves from exploring how deeply death has had its way with us, our changedness, something we've never really learned about in the context of death and grief. Within the project, I'm occasionally asked to share or speak. Typically, I'm asked to provide a bio. I have often written that the death of my soul connects took me apart, dismantled me, and that now I'm put together differently. It's such an infantile description, really, but it illustrates my transformation as succinctly as I can. As I mentioned previously, I believe that your trauma and grief can change you on a cellular level. Everything changes. The way you sleep, the way you eat, the way you breathe, the way you feel. And it's impossible to believe that these changes don't affect your very essence, transforming every aspect of you. These deep changes also occur after births, partnering, other times of beauty and tragedy. Thus is the essence of our walk through this life. I'm aghast that anything about grieving can be turned into a disorder. Yes, if you have an underlying autonomic system that organically revs, creating anxiety type symptoms or a history of depression, certainly bereavement can serve as kindling and fuel your symptom thinking. But the idea of turning grief into an abnormality that serves no one and creates even further invalidation and disconnection. Consider finding a partner to accompany you through your transformation. I believe the life experience of intimately dealing with the death of an essential relationship is necessary for a professional to effectively sit with you while you negotiate your experience with living and dying. And I say that you'll find some of those people that are available at the end of the book. So what I am saying is, because that might not be written the most clear way, is if you're going to see a therapist or a counselor, interview them and ask that they have experienced deep loss, okay? Not just loss, deep loss. As you move forward in your life, in your own life, you will carry the memory and the love of your deceased person with you. And I'll stop there because that's a lot, the bit on transformation, and that we end up sharing other people's transformation stories when I just ask them to, can you share in what way death has transformed you? This is how death has transformed me. Being able to have these conversations with you. I was always an advocate for deaf literacy, fluency. I was always an advocate in the medical arena for doctors and nurses to become more fluent with their own death and their ability to speak with people about that. Yes, I think Karen, you said it most succinctly one time, which was death was with me throughout my entire life and throughout my career, that I finally answered through this project in this book in a succinct way. So thank you.
That's really beautiful. And we are so fortunate that you answered and wrote the book. And I just want to thank you for the book and thank you for giving us an hour when I know you have really busy travels going on and visiting with family, lots of things happening in your life. And I appreciate so much that you were here with us today for this hour.
This was my absolute pleasure. I just love the energy of sitting with other people who can have these conversations. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And yeah, thanks to everyone who attended. I think someone just signed on who might have had the time mixed up a little bit, who, because we're ending now instead of beginning. And I'm sorry, but I'm sending out the link so everyone can listen who might have missed. Sent a link to this recording. So thank you, Becky, and I want to wish you safe travels for the rest of your journey here in the U.S. and then your trip back to New Zealand. And get ready. I mean, a number of us will probably be showing up in the next few months.
Hey,
So.
come on. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome. And there are all kinds of people saying thank you, Becky.
Thank you.
Appreciate you so very much.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
Well, take care, Becky, and all of you who've attended. Take care. Best wishes to all of you too, and keep reading, and we'll keep sharing and helping each other through this process.
Thank you for all the work you're doing in this area, Karen. It's amazing.
It's so my very deep pleasure. So thank you. I'm going to end the recording now.